All right, I'm going to begin by wishing you all a good evening. I'm sorry I cannot be there with you in person in Bilbao. I've been in Bilbao a few times, and it's a very exciting part of Europe, indeed of the world. But while I usually have come to these conferences, it wasn't possible this year. As you just heard, I'm going to speak about good work and about what it means to do good in the world. And I will describe research and findings from the last 20 years, as well as some of the research and applied work that we're doing nowadays. Then, as promised in the title, I'll talk a little bit about how pursuit of the good has become more complicated, more vexed in the digital era, and I'll conclude by trying to put my remarks together. So I want to begin with what I call the figure ground challenge. Figure ground is a metaphor from the world of perception. Here's a 19th century painting, and you can see in the front of the painting, at least you can see most noticeably the pictures and the fruit and the tablecloth, and then the background is the wall and the floor underneath the table. When we talk about figure, it's what is it that you notice when you look at any scene, whether it's a scene in 3 dimensions or a scene in a work of art. And I maintain that in much of the educational landscape today, whether you're in the Americas or in Europe or in East Asia or other parts of the planet, what you find is people are focusing almost exclusively on how students do on certain kinds of tests, particularly tests which look at ability to choose the correct answer from a small number of choices. You're all familiar with this. And what happens with the scores on these exams is that countries are rank ordered in terms of how well they do on a test like the PISA or the TIMSS. And as you can see, certain countries like Korea, Finland, Canada, Switzerland do very well, but many of the countries assembled in Bilbao don't do so well. And I have nothing against these kind of international comparisons, but when they dominate the landscape so much that you can't pay attention or see anything else, that's very bad. And so if we're looking for a better figure, a better thing to focus on, what I've done with my colleagues over the last 20 years is to focus on what it means to be good and to do good. And if we think about this for a minute, we're really comparing 2 visions. One vision is, do we want to be the very best in certain kinds of performances which are measured by certain kinds of instruments? Or do we want to be the kind of society in which people would like to live? A society in which people are moral, ethical, try to do the right thing, try to be good citizens, try to do their profession in a responsible way. Because what good does it do to have high test scores if this is an environment in which human beings don't thrive? Also, if human beings are thriving, does it really matter how well people do on tests? I would say that it's better to do well on tests than not, but not if it dominates the educational scene and essentially destroys or blocks out other kinds of goals for education. So, of course, you're all thinking, well, what's good, what's bad, who decides? And those are complicated issues. It's not obvious, but I thought I would just show you some faces of people who may be familiar to you, and you can tell me whether you think they would qualify for the label good or not. This is Nelson Mandela, of course, one of the most respected human beings from the 20th century. This is Gandhi, also in the earlier part of the 20th century, certainly one of the most admired human beings in recent times. Now, you may not recognize this person, but when I tell you he's Bernie Madoff, who was a leading person of misinvesting people's money, pretending to give them big returns, in fact, simply having what's called a Ponzi scheme, where hundreds and hundreds of people lost huge amounts of money because of Bernie Madoff's misleading financial claims. Most people would not consider for him to be a good person, and indeed he's in jail where I would say he deserves to be. We don't have to take much time on Hitler. Don't think he would make a list of good people and anybody who's listening to me or watching this slideshow. So there are examples of people where you'd have widespread agreement about who is good and who is not good. But there are more difficult cases. Take this one. Many of you will recognize Julian Assange, who is the person who revealed on WikiLeaks many secret documents from the political and corporate world over the years. And people are sharply divided on whether Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, who revealed many secret documents from the United States government, whether those people are good or not. And for those of you who know your American history, this is President Lyndon Johnson, who did many things which were admired domestically, but also got the United States trapped in a war which was ill-conceived and which we couldn't extricate ourselves from. So what I'm trying to do here in a playful way is to suggest that there are cases of good and bad, which are pretty unambiguous, but there are also cases which are more complicated, and many people nowadays would fit into that mixed category. So today I want to talk about three kinds of good, and you'll hear this throughout the talk: good person, good worker, good citizen. They're not the same, otherwise I could just talk about one, but what it means to be a good person, a good worker, or a good citizen. And to make it a bit more concrete, I'm going to use an example from the United States, which will be more familiar to people from the US, but I think most of you will recognize what it takes to get into a school, a college or university in the United States. So one thing you have to do is take tests and write essays. And here's a young man doing that. He's hoping to get into college or university, and a young woman also filling out an application. And we can think of three different adults and their relationship to the college admissions process. Number one, let's say you're a neighbor of the young boy or girl, and they say, would you write a letter of recommendation for me for getting into the college? Now, if you don't know the child at all, or you think the child is really not prepared for college or university, you might say no. But most of us would be inclined to be good neighbors, to say yes, and to write the most positive letter that we could. So that's what I call being a good person. A second role is the college dean. This is the man or woman who gets to decide who gets into a competitive college like Princeton or Stanford and who doesn't. And we expect that people like this will make the fairest judgment possible. They won't be bribed. They won't admit people just because they know them personally. Of course, sometimes there are deans who do that, who play favor with people of wealth or play favor with people whom they know, but then that person is not being a good worker. They're not being a good professional. Then, let's say where you live, city, town, state, what we call it, in your jurisdiction, there's a referendum. A referendum means you go to the polls and you vote about whether affirmative action should be permitted. Affirmative action is the term we use to say that if a person's applying to college or university and he or she comes from a disadvantaged minority, typically an African American, a black, or a Hispanic, that person should be able to get into college even if his or her record isn't as strong as that of a majority person, which would be a white person. Now, when you go to vote about this, you could vote just for whatever fits your own personal desire, but you could also vote in the way that you think is best for the society, even if it might mean that your own child wouldn't have as good a chance. So, to be concrete, if you're a wealthy white person, affirmative action works against you because your child is not likely to get admitted if there's a minority student who has an equally good record. Yet you might think that it's important for society that we have more minority students in our colleges and universities, and so you might vote for that referendum, even though it doesn't serve your own interest, in which case I would say that you're being a good citizen. So again, the purpose of these examples is to talk about three roles which any of us could play. The role of the neighbor, being asked to write the letter, the role of the dean, deciding who gets in and who doesn't, and the role of the voter, who decides what are the rules by which we decide who should be admitted to schools when they come from different social economic groups. The distinction which comes out of our work is between what I call neighborly morality and the ethics of roles. This will recur through the talk. It's not completely intuitive, but let me try to give you a first definition of these two contrasting situations. Neighborly morality is how we behave with people whom we see every day, people who live in our neighborhood. And if you think about the Ten Commandments or about the Golden Rule, this is really about how do we deal with neighbors. You treat neighbors the way you want to be treated. You don't lie to them. You don't steal from them. You don't kill them. You don't commit adultery. You honor your father and mother. And neighborly morality is what's being called on when you're asked to write a letter for a young person whom you know. Neighborly morality has existed since the Ten Commandments, since the Golden Rule, and we really have nothing new to say about that, even though it's not always achieved. Many people are not good neighbors. They don't practice neighborly morality, but it's very old in civilization. What's much newer and what we focus on in our work is how do people behave in roles? How do we behave if we're a professional? Doctor, a lawyer, a journalist, a teacher, a superintendent, a principal. And how do we behave as a citizen of our community, the citizen of our state, our nation, our region, and of the planet? Let me say about the region, many of you are in Europe now. Europe is about to make a very big decision. Should Greece be allowed to stay in the European Union? That's a citizenship decision. And frankly, there's nothing in the Bible and nothing in the Ten Commandments that's going to tell you how to vote about whether Greece should be allowed to remain in the European Union. Of course, now the Greeks themselves are voting on this topic. Also, there's nothing in the Bible or in the law which tells you what to do if you're a teacher and you're faced with a difficult ethical problem, or you're a lawyer or a doctor or a journalist. And if you're a journalist and you're covering a war and you see that one side is about to launch an ambush on the other, what is your loyalty to the side that might be ambushed, or to your role as a journalist, where you have to describe what's actually happening as accurately as possible? So the reason for distinguishing the ethics of roles is these are decisions which people face every day as workers, as professionals, and as citizens. And even though we might consult the Bible or the Code of Hammurabi, or the Golden Rule, we can't get good answers to those questions. And that's why I talk about the ethics of roles, the role of worker and citizen. So to be much more concrete, you're dealing with young people in schools, whether you're dealing with preschoolers or people in secondary school or graduate students or indeed young professionals. Will this person be a good person? Will they behave the way we expect neighbors to behave? Will they be a good worker, the way we expect teachers or journalists who do a good job to behave? Will they be a good citizen, whether they're a citizen of their own community or a citizen of the planet? If I have a communicable disease and I get on an airplane which flies from one continent to another, and I spread the disease, which could be a virus that's very dangerous, SARS or Ebola, I'm being a bad world citizen. Similarly, if I insist on buying a lot of cars which guzzle a lot of petroleum, a lot of fossil fuels, I'm not being a good world citizen because I'm contributing to global warming. So in our work, we're trying to think about being a good person, but particularly about how to become a good worker or a good citizen, because unless that's attacked in our educational system, people will never achieve those desirable goals. So just 20 years ago, with William Damon and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, we began a long project called the Good Work Project. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about emanates from that project, which began in 1995. The personal origin of the Good Work Project was that each of us had contributed ideas in the academy. The person who introduced me mentioned multiple intelligences, and even though we liked our ideas, we had seen those ideas misused, abused, used in ways we didn't like it. And so one question which motivated the Good Work Project is, what responsibility does a scholar have when he sees his or her work that's being misused? There was also a political origin of the project. This was a time when the Berlin Wall had fallen down, and all over the world people were saying, markets are good, neoliberal thought is good, and the whole world should really operate in terms of free markets and return on investment. And we had nothing against markets. They play an important role, and we were beneficiaries of markets. So in that sense, it made our citizenship accented. But we realized that you cannot really have a good society if everything is simply controlled by markets. And the last 20 years has just provided ample evidence that unrestricted markets don't work. But rather than having simply attitudes, we interviewed over 1,200 people in 9 different professions, including higher education, pre-collegiate education, law, medicine, journalism, and several others. And we saw how people in those professions defined what it was that constitutes good work. And I will talk a bit more about what we did. Here's a summary of the question that we eventually asked. And the last line here says, does this sound familiar? And as I'm reading it, you might ask, do you recognize this? How do people who want to do good work, let's say other teachers or researchers whom you know in your town, succeed or fail at a time when things are changing very quickly? Our sense of time and space is being altered by technology, the web, the internet, various apps, social media, and so on. Market forces are very powerful. And here's the key phrase, there are few forces around which can moderate, mediate, or modulate market forces. Market forces have always existed, going back to the Stone Age, but there were religious views, communitarian views, isms, socialism, communism, fascism, which operated to mediate or moderate markets. But with the fall of the wall and the height of neoliberal thinking, you really were, and even today, they really are not good counterforces. So markets are unrestrained, and we argue in the long run, that's not good for people as neighbors, workers, or citizens. Now, this is a political statement. You might disagree with it politically, but if you reflect on the events of recent decades and what's happened, for example, to a profession like law, I think you might see some merit in this particular political perspective. As the last line says, if there's anybody here who doesn't recognize the risk of things changing very quickly, our whole sense of time and space being altered, and the very extreme powers of markets, which, by the way, is what pushes for exams like PISA or TIMSS, because they're seen as a stand-in for the country's economic prowess, strength, then you are a fortunate person if you don't see that. So here's just some of the professions we looked at: lawyers and judges, medical researchers, teachers, advocates. So I now want to summarize what are the two principal findings which emerged from our 20-year study of good work. It's what we call the 3 E's of good work and the importance of alignment. So let me say a word about each. Good work we define as consisting of 3 descriptors, each beginning with the letter E. Good work is technically excellent, personally engaging, and carried out in an ethical way. So I imagine most people in Bilbao are either teachers or researchers. So if you're a good worker as a teacher, you know your subject matter, you care, you look forward to teaching, and you try to do it in an ethical way. When you're faced with a dilemma, you try to think about what's the right thing to do, not what's the most expedient thing to do, or the thing for which I would get paid the most. For example, training kids to do well on a test, maybe even telling them what the questions are. So if you're a researcher, you know the literature, have you got good technical skills, you care, you look forward to coming to the lab or to doing your studies, and you carry it out ethically. You try to figure out exactly what your findings are, or you try to twist them or torque them so they're more likely to get published or more likely to be paid attention to. And if you're in the audience and you come from another profession, anything from journalism to dentistry, I think you should be able to recognize the 3 E's. We call this ENA, making a joke about DNA, which is a double helix. This is ENA because you don't have ENA unless you're excellent and engaged and ethical. And of course, you can have 1 or 2 of them, but then you don't qualify as being a good worker. The next slide is not one I'm going to try to unpack. I'm just going to put it up there because what we discovered in our study is good work is much easier to do when a profession is well aligned. And by alignment, I simply mean that everybody involved in the profession wants the same thing, pretty much. So we began by studying journalism and genetics. And it turned out, even 20 years ago, journalism was very poorly aligned. The different stakeholders, editors, journalists, publishers, readers, advertisers, all wanted different things. And so journalism was very poorly aligned, and it was very difficult to carry out good work in journalism. In contrast, 20 years ago, genetics was very well aligned. Everybody wanted the same thing: live longer, be healthier. There were very few constraints on geneticists. Just think about school. If you're in a school where the students, the parents, the government, the business all want pretty much the same thing, you're probably in Finland. That's a bit of a joke, but Finland is a well-aligned educational system from everything I know about it. On the other hand, most countries, including mine, are quite poorly aligned with students, teachers, parents, political figures, corporate figures wanting different kinds of things, and it's much more difficult to carry out good work when you're in a poorly aligned field. The classic example in the United States is when a whole school system cheats in an examination, as happened in the city of Atlanta a few years ago, where over 100 teachers were accused of basically fixing the exams of students so that they looked like they were doing better than they really could do. And this is a classical example of what we call outcome controls, pushing people in one way and personal standards pushing them in another way. But again, this is a slide which you'd have to take a look at our publications to have unpacked. But the idea of alignment, of everybody wanting the same thing, makes good work easier, though it doesn't make it, it doesn't force it to happen. They're good workers in very poorly aligned fields, and in well-aligned fields, they're people who cut corners and who cheat. So it's just a promoter of good work. It's not at all a guarantee of good work. Now, until we began to think about citizenship about 10 years ago, we hadn't realized that the 3 E's of good work apply equally to the area of citizenship. So here's a slide on people voting in the United States, but I'm sure in most of your countries you have similar polling places. And if you think about the good citizen now, and I mentioned this earlier, the good citizen knows the law, the rules, the regulations. They may not have memorized the Constitution, but they kind of know how their government works. They're engaged, they care. They listen to the news, they read the newspaper, they blog or circulate news stories. They care. They will write letters, they'll vote, and so on. And they try to not just promote their own self-interest in citizenship, which of course is one view, but instead try to think of what's better for the country as a whole, or the world as a whole. So I might like having a lot of cars which are fuel inefficient, but probably if I want to be a good citizen, I should vote for legislation which tries to reduce carbon in the atmosphere, including things which might make my life a little bit less fun, but might be better for the world. So an unexpected finding was that the 3 E's of good work apply equally to the realm of citizenship. So here, in a sense, is the task. There are many forces in society which could help or hinder the development of good persons, good workers, and good citizens. But I don't think there's anybody in Bilbao today who believes that the schools don't have an important role to play in the development of good persons, good workers, and good citizens. And so most of our own research has been thinking particularly about school-based interventions which can help the cultivation of the good. So you might think, just as a change of pace, who do you consider to be a good worker or a good citizen? If I was in the hall, I might have you stand and talk to your neighbor for a minute about whom you admire at work or citizen, or civics. If you don't have an answer to the question, what does that mean? Kind of sad if you can't think of people who are good workers or good citizens. And then you might think about, how do we help to engender good workers or good citizens? What's the role of different kinds of mentors or people who torment or fragment, as well as paragons? I imagine there's nobody in the audience who met Gandhi, and few people who'd met Nelson Mandela, but we can still be inspired by those people, just as many people nowadays are inspired by Pope Francis, even though most of us have not met him. So there are there is help to good work and good citizenship from people whom we know, but also people whom we read about historically or contemporaneously, or indeed in literature. We all have people in literature or in movies whom we admire, as well as people whom we don't. So this is just kind of a reminder slide about halfway through the talk. Good persons are the way we behave as neighbors, for example, to the child down the block who wants us to recommend them. And there's a long tradition in religious documents and political documents of what it means to be a good neighbor. But then there's the new roles for which there's not much guidance traditionally. What does it mean to be an ethical journalist or an ethical scientist? And what does it mean to be an ethical citizen in the various jurisdictions or polities in which we all live, including in a timely fashion what it means to be a member of the European Union when Greece is in jeopardy of losing its status. So I now want to turn more to what our research group has been trying to develop over the last decade or so. We recognize that religion can play a role. The home obviously plays a role. The mass media play a role, not always a constructive role. There's a lot of glorification in the media of bad work and bad citizenship. And of course, the messages in the community, the leaders of the community, the institutions. But as I said, our focus is very much in what can be done educationally. So we developed something which we now call the Good Project. If I were talking to you 3 years ago, I would have talked about the Good Work Project. But now we have what we call the progeny of good work, good citizenship, good collaboration, good friends, and so on. So we've created this umbrella, which you can go to on the web, thegoodproject.org, and you can read about the various endeavors that we have become engaged in after finishing the initial good work project. We also write a lot. There are many people from Project Zero, where I work in Bilbao, and one of the things we do is write. We write articles, we write blogs, we communicate in social media, and we write books. And in fact, for those of you interested, there are no fewer than 10 books which grew out of the Good Work Project, which names like Good Business, Good Mentoring, Making Good, and so on. So that's another way of giving away our work. But we're also developing much more practical instruments. One of them is the Good Work Toolkit, which is a very extensive set of exercises, which we developed initially for college and for professionals. So people are actually in professional schools, like a law school or a journalism school, or people who are on the job. But not surprisingly, there was demand first from secondary schools and then elementary schools. So there are materials where you can do good work kinds of exercises with much younger people than with adolescents or adults. And the Good Work Toolkit is our most useful toolkit, our most useful intervention. But just a few weeks ago, we posted a new toolkit called the Good Collaboration Toolkit, which features the 8 elements, ELEMENTS, of good collaboration. And if any of you is interested in that, it's been posted now on the Good Project website. And if you are collaborating with another organization, you want to have tips about how to become good collaborators, excellent, engaged, and ethical, I commend the Good Collaboration Toolkit to you. A little bit over 10 years ago, we had a very disturbing finding in the United States, and it was very transformative for our research group. We described it in a book called Making Good, How Young People Cope with Moral Dilemmas at Work. The senior author was Wendy Fishman, with whom I worked for 20 years. And what we found out in this book is that many young people in America, and I think this finding would be true in other countries, certainly in other developed countries, and I think it's even more true in the United States today than it was 15 years ago is they tell us they admire good work. And some of them really try to do good work. They try to be excellent and engaged and ethical. But many of them said to us, we can't afford to be good workers today because we want to be rich, famous, successful, kings of the universe, queens of the universe. To do that, we have to leave no stone unturned. And if we try to be ethical, if we try to behave in a proper way, other people who cut corners will get that success, that money, that fame, which we like. So these young people told us, and again, I think it would be even more true today, someday when we get to be rich, famous, and successful, then we'll be good workers. We'll set a good example. We'll hire good workers. We'll train good workers. But until now, we can't afford to do that. So we want to be given a pass. We want to be allowed to do compromised work. And I always like to quote St. Augustine, who in his autobiography, in his memoirs, said, "O Lord, make me chaste, make me clean, make me virtuous, but not yet." And what they were telling us is someday they'll be good workers, but for now, they can't afford to do it. And this was sufficiently troubling to us that a lot of our work now has been with students in college, really trying to get them to understand that whether you're a good worker starts today or tomorrow and not at some unseen time in the future. So this has been a very abstract discussion. Let me talk about two examples from our Good Work Toolkit. And these are examples which young people, secondary school or college, discuss, university. Teachers often find them equally interesting, which is a bonus. Debbie is a journalist in an American secondary school. She's a very good journalist. She's the editor of her newspaper. Her grandfather was a famous journalist for the New York Times, so she comes from a lineage of great journalists. There's a rape on campus in her school. And as a good journalist, she feels she should report the rape. Moreover, if there's a rapist on campus, people need to know about that. But she's called in by the school headmaster, and he says, you can't publish an article about the rape because next week is the week when people come to visit the school to decide whether they want to send their child to the school. And if they hear there's a rape, they won't send their child to the school. So I forbid you to publish this story. So she's very confused, doesn't know what to do. She comes home and tells her mother, and her mother gives her a big hug and says, Debbie, you're wonderful. I'm proud of you. Your grandfather, the journalist, would be proud of you. But, she says, your brother Teddy wants to apply to the school next year, and if you disobey the headmaster, then he may not get into the school. So you ought to think very carefully about what to do. So this is a good neighbor versus good worker versus good citizen kind of dilemma, because as a good neighbor, she wants to help her brother. As a good journalist, she wants to cover the story. And there's also people in the community need to know about that rape. On the other hand, the headmaster has a very different view about what it means to be a good citizen of the community. We could talk about this endlessly, but let me tell you about Mike. Mike is a very good teacher of chemistry. He's very respected by the students. They really think they learn a lot. But he's a tough grader. And so the students come in and say, Mike, we think you're a great teacher, but your grading is too tough. You're not getting enough A's or high grades. And so we're not getting into the best colleges. We're not winning the biggest prizes. So we think you should have a much looser kind of grading system. But this goes against Mike's philosophy, which is the grade should be an honest communication of how the student is doing and not a bribe so the students would like him or so the student would get some kind of a prize, which the student may or may not deserve. So you can see these are real life kinds of issues, just like the cheating pressures on the teachers in Atlanta, Georgia, are real life issues. And young people need to talk about it. And often, and this I think is particularly important for people over the age of 40, the students' ideas of what are ethical and moral are just totally different from any ideas which older people have. And that doesn't mean we're right and they're wrong. It means we need to understand what they consider it means to be moral or ethical compared to whatever precepts we may have had from an earlier era. So what are the things which help promote good work? When there are older people around who embody good work and who encourage it and explain why it's needed. When there are peers, others your age, who have good values, talk about it, and who are not willing to stand up and confront you if you do things which are unethical, which are compromise. Periodic booster shots, when something very good or something very bad happens in a community, that's the time to really focus on what the values of our community are and how we can achieve them. And this is what we call institutional culture. When something bad happens, is it hidden? Is it repressed? Is it distorted? Or does the community get together and talk about what happened, why it happened, and whether we can prevent it from happening again? So these are things which I think all of you have a sense of. And if you have a lucky enough to have been in a healthy community, whether it was at home, in church, at the job, in school, then it's much easier for you to try to recreate that than if you hadn't had the good fortune of seeing what a healthy community is like. And of course, mentoring, which was written by Gene Nakamura, one of the people in the project, is the most important way for workers and citizens to learn what it means to be ethical as well as engaged and excellent. And if you don't have good mentors, it's just much harder. But our own research suggests that in almost every profession, the amount of mentoring is much less for many, many different reasons. And that's very hard because if you haven't seen examples of good work and good citizenship and been helped to achieve that in your own life, it's much, much more difficult because you have to invent it on your own. So I wanted to say a couple of words and really lay the groundwork for Carrie James, who's going to talk with you in a couple of days about what we call good play, what it means to do good work in the digital era. But let me just lay out the problem space for you. Nowadays, especially for young people, the world is simply permeated with digital media, with virtual realities like Second Life, with multi-user games like World of Warcraft, with social media like Facebook, with information sources like Wikipedia, with new kinds of messaging like Twitter, with very smart devices which do many things that people used to do, robots. And then this is a very, to my mind, nefarious app called Yik Yak, which is well known in American educational institutions. I don't know whether in other countries you know about it, but it basically works in a geographically limited area, a mile or two, and it allows you to say things anonymously. So in a school, it can be poison because you can say anonymous things about fellow students, about teachers, about supervisors, about people who work in the dining hall or who clean the rooms, and you say it anonymously, and it can very quickly poison the atmosphere. And these are all things which those of you over 40 or so did not have to deal with when you were in school or when you were learning to be a researcher or an educator, but these have complicated the practice of good work and good citizenship enormously. Katie Davis and I wrote about this in a book called The App Generation, which is available now in quite a few languages. And what we focused on there was that apps are now very easy to use, and they allow us to do many things that more efficiently than we could before. And almost everybody I know benefits from having apps. But apps can be problematic in three ways. One, they push you to package yourself to create an attractive icon long before you may be ready to do that. You don't want to be tied down to what you look like when you're 13 or 14 or 15. Number two, there's lots of evidence that people tend to group mostly with people who just agree with them. They silo, they have an echo effect, a funnel effect, and that's not good for having a broader view of issues. And then what we emphasize in our book is that it's good to have apps if they enable you to do things which you want to do anyway. But if you become dependent on apps and only do those things for which apps currently exist, really narrow, if not strangle, your life options. So that's the app generation. When Carrie James and I and Katie Davis and others began to think about the new media that I just showed you, Facebook, Twitter, Wikipedia, and so on, we realized that the new media are threatening at least 5 very important aspects of life, which are not easy to deal with, but have become more complicated. Identity, who you are, and how you present yourself to the world. Privacy. Most people feel there should be private thoughts and private communications, but privacy has become extremely problematic in the digital era because everything can be circulated. Anybody who's a teacher or indeed a researcher knows about intellectual property and how much more precarious it is now because everything can be circulated and transformed, and it's very difficult to figure out who gets credit for what. And so many people parade things as being their own, including students who plagiarize almost without thinking about it. How do we decide whom to trust, who is credible, and who is not in the digital world when we can't look at people like neighbors and watch them every day, but they come and go and they can post all kinds of things and we have no idea whether they're reliable or not? And then the most important thing, the thing which actually connects the other 4, is what does it mean to participate in a community? Thousands of years, a community was just your neighbors. Hundreds of years ago, it became your profession and your civic role. But now, as soon as you enter the digital world, you are in a community of size and space whose duration you cannot ever know for sure. You can never know whether a photograph or a message that you sent to anybody, even if it was completely private, can't be captured and circulated by somebody and preserved indefinitely. And this can start as early as the age of 5. I have grandchildren who are as proficient with social media and with devices as I am. And so our whole notion of what a community is, what a neighborhood is, what it means to be a citizen or a worker is really being reinvented in our lives. And it could be very exciting, but it could be frightening as well. And this is Carrie, whom you will meet soon. And I recommend really highly her book, Disconnected, where she talks about the challenges that the digital media pose to what it means to be a good worker, a good citizen, and a good person. You might also want to read the interesting foreword to the book by Henry Jenkins, who's one of the leading media experts in the world. So this is telling you that if you go to Carrie, you'll get some answers to what the good work, good citizenship landscape is like in the digital era. So I want to conclude now with just a couple of messages. In case you're wondering, what are the ingredients of good work for yourself? What's your mission? Whether you're a teacher, researcher, manager, leader, what are the goals of your profession and what are your personal goals and roles? Whom do you look up to and why? Whom do you disdain and why? The mirror test is, if you look at yourself in the mirror clearly, not without squinting, but with eyes open, are you proud or kind of embarrassed by where you stand on the 3 E's of good work and citizenship? And however you decide about that for yourself, if you look at your profession as a whole, whether it's doing scientific research or being a teacher or a manager or a minister, are you kind of proud about what people are, or are you not? Because if you're not, even if your own plate looks good, you have obligations, particularly as you get older, to worry about the state of your profession. All I want to say here is we are very serious about our research on the good. I mentioned the new goods that have emerged. These are some of the places we're working with. And the second point says we're eager for more collaborators. So if you're excited about these ideas, if you think we're spending too much time on PISA tests and not enough on type of human beings we want, let us know. Get in touch with us. And we especially need to know whether different interventions, ours and others, such as the ones mentioned here, are they effective in producing a higher incidence of good work or good citizenship? soon. This is a bit of a light touch. Maybe we'll have the good app, how it is to help people become better workers and citizens. So, the current figure ground all over the world, from Finland to Brazil, from Canada to New Zealand, from Malaysia to every Chinese province, people looking at test scores. We say, let's look at the kind of society you want to have, the kind of people you want to have, the kind of institutions you want to have, and what are we doing to help develop those good citizens, good workers, good people. The Good Work Project is a serious effort to answer that question. I gave you some findings and claims. There's tons of stuff on our websites, as well as in the 10 books we've written. We're the various offsprings, including Good Play, which Carrie James will talk about, when she also talks about how the good is being reframed, that's my word, in the digital era. And finally, we're not resting. As long as we have the energy and the support, we can continue our focus on the good. So, since this is a conference on thinking, most of you know that I spent most of my life studying intelligence and cognition. I make no apologies for that, though I did hear Joe Renzulli talk about the eye test, and I liked hearing that. This message comes from an American philosopher, Ralph Waldo Emerson, of the middle of the 19th century. And Emerson said, character is more important than intelligence. I love intelligences, I love intellects, but in the end of the day, it's the kind of human beings that we develop which is most important. And I hope that whatever work you do in the area of thinking, you will think a lot about how to make sure that those cognitive skills, those cognitive competences, those cognitive aspirations are moved in a good direction rather than neutrally or in a destructive direction. So here's where you can go for more information, mostly in English, though there is some information available in Spanish, thegoodproject.org, Project Zero, or my website. Thank you very much. Good